Welcome to Democracy Differently, the podcast about why democracy isn't working and how to fix it. I'm your host for today, Jess, and I'm here with John Wall, who is a distinguished professor of philosophy, religion and childhood studies at Rutgers University Camden and director of the Childism Institute and the Children's Voting Colloquium. John's research focuses on the intersection between political philosophy and the rights of children, and he is best known for the development of the critical theory of childism and his research and advocacy around ageless suffrage. So thanks, John, so much for coming on today.
My pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
So anyone who listens to this podcast will know we always ask the same first question. So in a sentence, what do you see as the single biggest problem with democracy?
Yeah, I think the biggest problem right now is that contemporary democracies are structured for short-termism, by which I mean they fail to hold representatives accountable for anything besides immediate economic impacts, current powerful interests, or individual over collective types of thinking and well-being.
Great, thanks. And that hopefully links very nicely into your work on childism. So for our listeners that maybe don't know what the term means, what is childism?
Well, it's a term that refers to the effort to empower children. So it's analogous to feminism or critical race theory or decolonialism or other kinds of theories. So the idea is that children are systematically disempowered by the ways our societies are currently set up, and we need to attend to the normative structures and the assumptions and the historically imposed assumptions of adultism or patriarchy that put children in a binary opposition to adults and systematically disempower them as a result.
So why is it time then possibly to give children the right to vote?
Yeah, I mean, for me, there's two main reasons. The first one is for children themselves. I think it would systematically improve children's lives. And by children, I know that can mean different things in different places, but I'm referring to the third of humanity who are under the age of 18, roughly speaking. That sector of humanity is the poorest, least healthy, most publicly restricted and least free and most systematically disadvantaged group in current political environments, democratic or otherwise. And so suffrage would have the effect of forcing politicians to start taking their interests as seriously as those as adults, instead of only being incentivized directly to respond to the interests of adults. And the second reason is I actually think giving children suffrage would save our democracies. We're currently seeing a slide, as democracies periodically do, into a kind of authoritarianism, where there's a paternalistic logic at play, where the supposedly deserving get to rule over the supposedly not deserving. And I think children's suffrage would change the mindset in politics and democracy around who are politicians really accountable, and how can they be held accountable to all the people, regardless of how powerful or strong or supposedly central to a society they seem to be.
Great, thanks. And I guess that really kind of intersects with the idea of short-termism as well, right?
Absolutely, yes, because we're also incentivized to respond to very immediate interests of the powerful few, really.
Yeah, great. You mentioned earlier that our history of voting reforms and universal suffrage really show that we can extend the right to vote. For example, we'll take women's suffrage as one of the main kind of examples there, and we removed the gender barrier, for example. So why do you think the age barrier has always kind of stayed, for most countries anyway?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because it was only 150 years ago or so that men even got the universal suffrage, and women was a little over 100 years ago in most societies or less. 2015 was the last time that women gained suffrage in Saudi Arabia. So we tend to forget how recent all of this history is. But and also part of the history is that the age barrier has gone up and down. It's gone from traditionally 21. It used to actually be lower, and in fact, there were children who voted in the past when it was only wealthy landowning males who could vote. There were boys included in that. But it's gone up to 26, down to 21, up to 24 in different societies. But to come back to your question, the age barrier has remained stubbornly persistent, I think, because of the Enlightenment, which defined democracy. That's not when democracy necessarily began, but it imposed a definition of democracy that was built around a supposedly adult ideal of the independent, self-ruling thinker, the autonomous individual. When, for example, in my country, the U.S., when it gained independence, that meant only about 6% of the population actually had the vote, which was landowning white males. And the same would have been true in the UK and in many early democracies up until quite, not so long ago. But what happened is this ideal of adulthood became the defining characteristic, and groups that gained suffrage had to sort of prove their adulthood. So whether it was the poor or racial minorities or women, in the sense of proving that they were not like children who are irrational and emotional and dependent, but instead they're like supposed adults who are the opposite of that. So childlikeness has been the calling card of exclusion from democracy, and I think that's why since the Enlightenment, and so I think that's why it's such a persistent barrier now, because it's at the roots of the problem.
Yeah, that's really interesting, that kind of interplay between, like you say, being childlike and having the right to vote because you're an adult. So do you think there is some exclusion that is necessary for a functioning democracy, or should we kind of throw out the rule book here?
Well, I think the very term democracy by definition refers to inclusion. The demos in its simplest is just the people. I've seen very good arguments for including resident non-citizens in the vote, and excluding non-resident citizens on account of who is actually impacted most directly by their vote. I myself was a non-citizen in this country because I moved here from England, and I was impacted by a lot of policies, but I had no say over them for 7 years until I got to become a citizen. But in general, the idea of democracy that's evolved is, or should be at least, is that anyone directly impacted by policies and who wishes to be included in affecting those policies should be able to have a vote in what they are. And it ought to be as simple as that. It's the inclusion of anybody who wants to be included, but it's not.
Yeah, thank you. So are there any examples from around the world where children do have the right to vote at the moment? And what do these examples sort of show us?
Yeah. So at the moment, there are about 20 countries in the world that have a national voting age of 16, and then there are thousands of cities as well that have the same thing. The first country to do that was actually Nicaragua in 1986, I think it was, followed by Brazil, and now there are lots of other countries. Technically, there are younger people who can vote today because there are some countries in which the right to vote comes with marriage. And in many countries in the world, you can marry below the age of 16. So there are probably children, people under 16 voting in place in the world. But it shows a couple of things. I mean, one of them is that 16-year-olds are entirely capable of voting, and there's no issue at all with knowledge or capacity or competence or anything like that. I think that's problematic because the definition of competency for 16-year-olds is analogous to adult competency, and I think competency is actually much broader than that. But it does show that they're capable, and it also has generally resulted in higher rates of turnout because 16-year-olds tend to be in a less volatile time of their lives than 18-year-olds who might be going off, leaving home or going to work or to university or something. So it establishes a more consistent voting habit, and it's been shown to lead to stronger turnout after adulthood for people who could vote at 16.
Great. So you mentioned there that the kind of capacities and capability that children might have, especially 16-year-olds, for example. And I think probably some of the objections that people have against a child's right to vote really stem around the fact that they're perhaps not capable or have a capacity for knowledge that meets the threshold. So why are these arguments just not successful, do you think?
Yeah, that's the main argument that I hear, both in the academic literature and in non-academic circles. And there's a few reasons why that doesn't work, the competency or knowledge argument. I mean, the first one is that capacity for knowledge is actually not a limitation for adults. So it's in fact it's been proven to be demonstrably undemocratic when competency tests have been imposed, like we had the Jim Crow voting laws in the South around things like that. And so if you can't impose it for adults, then or if it's not a limitation for adults, then why should it be a limitation for children? And so I'm involved in a legal case at the moment in Canada to sue the government for eliminating all voting ages. And the argument we're using is a non-discrimination argument. And we're arguing that it's discriminatory to require a certain level of competence for people under 18 that you don't require for people over 18. And it never has been. Competence has never been a requirement for voting. So why is it imposed on children? Another reason is that competence, I think, is misunderstood, and it's based on this Enlightenment history. The competence to vote has nothing to do with whether you know what the branches of government are, or what laws are, or how economics works, or what military options are available for war, or anything like that. These are all things that adults actually know very little about. Most adults, including representatives, only know the very tip of the iceberg of what there is to know about what goes on in government. It's an extraordinarily complex set of phenomena. So the proper measure of voting knowledge is not that. It's simply whether you understand enough to know that you have a stake in the outcome. So do you know that option A is something you prefer over option B for your own life, in relation to your own experience? That's the only actual knowledge criterion that should exist in a democracy, and that's the only one that adults are held to. Adults can vote if they're just not curious at all about politics, or if they're stupid, I don't know. Or adults can vote if they have dementia. Someone can take their vote on their own behalf, or severe mental cognitive disabilities, or if they're in hospital in a coma. So the real competence is this, and I think you can measure that by whether somebody has the desire to vote. If you want to vote, that shows that you understand that you have a stake in the outcomes of voting, and that you see its relevance to yourself in relation to other people.
Thanks. And I think another criticism that people might level against a child's right to vote is a risk of manipulation, probably from parents, guardians, kind of any adults in their sphere. Um, do you think there is a risk there for in giving the children the right to vote?
Well, yes. Well, there is a risk because it actually does happen to everybody when they vote. Adults are constantly manipulated by politicians and media environments and the family members around them, their cultures, which might say, because you're this religion, you should vote this way or whatever. So humans are not independent in that sense of free of manipulation. So again, it's not a ban on adults to be not able to vote because they might be manipulated. But at the same time, I would also say that children are no more manipulable than anybody else. Um, if you know any actual children, you know that they have real views about things and ideas that they care about, and actually, you know, the fact that children have not been able to vote traditionally um, means that we don't know their levels of competence or how much they were being manipulated. They haven't had the chance to exercise it. If you looked at, you know, I mean, I hate to use this example again, but if you'd looked at women 200 years ago, you would have thought, oh, well, they don't know anything about politics. Why should they get the right to vote? But actually, they didn't know perhaps that much about politics, or they probably did, but they looked like they didn't because they didn't have, it wasn't a skill they needed to develop because they couldn't use it. So it's the same with children. And I don't, you know, if a child was manipulated by their parents, you know, it wouldn't be that different from adults, but also it wouldn't happen anyway, I don't think.
Yeah,
I don't think
thanks.
I don't think I put that very well. What I mean to say is that you know, children are not a uniquely manipulable class of people, I guess. That's how I would put it.
Yeah, I think that's makes perfect sense. So what if we think about the children themselves for a second? What would children gain from being able to vote, do you think?
Well, I think a couple of things. The first and probably most important thing is simply equal political dignity. So they would, instead of being second-class citizens in a structural sense, they would be first-class citizens like adults. It would give, it would, they would then be viewed by societies as people who ought to be listened to and have valuable opinions and perspectives to bring to society, which at the moment they're not. The second one is that they would get to have their issues on the table as much as adults. So they would be able to set the political agenda as much as adults. And this, I think, is actually the most important thing that suffrage does for any group. It doesn't necessarily give them everything they want, but it does give them the ability to direct what questions the politicians will address. So when poor white men got the vote, labor issues were suddenly on the table in politics, which they weren't before. When women got the vote, issues of discrimination, domestic abuse, violence, those kind of issues, or healthcare, not being fired when you're pregnant and things like that became political issues, which they just weren't before. And so putting those onto the table is very important. And so in children's cases, the issues that would suddenly, I think, rise higher in importance in the minds of politicians and policymakers would be the climate change emergency, poverty, because children are the poorest group in societies. Education policies would not be sort of window dressing, but actual meaningful and well-funded policies. Healthcare rights, lifelong healthcare, gun control in my country at least, transgender rights. You know, there'd be a list of things that children themselves bring into the sphere that benefits all of us, but are uniquely brought by particular groups.
Do you think this would change our democracies then, if these different ideas were brought to the fore.
Absolutely. I think it would be as big a change as any other group's enfranchisement. Um, it, if, from one perspective, it would make democracies democratic, because you would finally actually have universal suffrage, which at the moment is understood as universal adult suffrage, but the demos does include children, and and um, and so policy makers are supposed to be responsible to children equally to adults and to everybody. But at the moment, their incentive structure doesn't line up with that. They're incentivized to respond only to adults because they're the only ones who are going to potentially lose their jobs to. I think it would also make us think differently about democracy, because it would undercut the idea that democracy is a competition among individuals for their own personal interests, and it would form democracy into more of this kind of long-term idea. We'd have to pay attention to the future consequences, the longer-term future consequences of democracy, but also to the communal consequences, the ways in which we're interdependent on each other and need and sort of rely on each other as democratic fellow citizens. I also think we'd create better policies because we would have more pixels on the screen, so to speak, if that makes sense. At the moment, we only have 2/3 of the pixels, and we'd have a sharper picture with all of the pixels on the screen. And then the last thing I would say is that we'd be less likely to drift towards authoritarianism, because at the moment, for the first quarter of our lives, we're told your voice doesn't matter, you don't have political dignity, you're not a member of this political sphere. And if you're told that in your formative years, it's likely you're going to grow up not feeling as empowered as you should in a democracy, and being willing to give in to people who have simplistic ideas or come along and say, I will solve your problems for you. So I think we would just have a generally more democratic citizenry at the same time.
And on that idea of like democratic citizenry, we've spoken a lot about elections and voting, and they're obviously just one small aspect of democracy.
Yeah.
But why are elections and the inclusion and exclusion of people from them so important to democracy? It seems to be the thing that we always come back to when we think about democracy.
Well, you're absolutely right. I actually think voting is not necessarily the most powerful way of changing democracy. I do think having the right to vote is extremely powerful, but the mechanism of voting isn't necessarily as powerful as protest or organization or lots of other kinds of things. But why have other groups fought for centuries for this right to vote? And also children have been fighting for the right to vote since at least the 70s, but they've sued in courts, and they've formed political movements, they've formed organizations, but because of this adultistic nature of democracy, it all goes under the radar. But I think the reason is that it's the most fundamental human right. It's the right to participate in determining what your rights are. And so if you don't have that right, then all your other rights become less likely to come about or be defended. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So if we get a little bit more technical, I guess, for now. So in your book, you advocate for the idea of a proxy claim right to vote. So could you explain a little bit more about what this is, and how it would actually work in practice for children?
Exactly. Yes, absolutely. So what I argue for is a different kind of voting mechanism. And I think that every time a large group has gained suffrage, the way voting practically happens has changed. And we've come a long way since, men gathered in taverns to elect themselves to office. So the idea is a two-level voting system. It's a little bit modeled on medical decision making, actually. But so the my idea is that everybody from birth to death should have a proxy right to vote, which means that whether you're an infant or a young child or a person with severe disabilities, cognitive disabilities or impairments, or you have dementia, or for whatever reason you can't actually vote on your own behalf, you ought to have somebody, a proxy, who is able to vote on your behalf. So it would be a next of kin, it would be a guardian, a parent, or whoever it is that would make major medical decisions on your behalf would be the same person who could make major voting decisions on your behalf. But the claim side of the proxy claim vote is that everyone also at the same time has the universal right to claim the exercise of their vote on their own behalf. So let's say a 5-year-old wants to vote for themselves instead of having a guardian do it for them. They have the right to do that, and the guardian can't stop them. They just have to go and vote. Or anybody else, somebody who's been in hospital, let's say, or traveling or something like that. There are actually proxy votes in many countries for various different kinds of reasons. And so this is really just expanding on that in a certain regard. But the point is that anybody who wants to vote has thereby demonstrated their capacity to vote and therefore should be able to vote and have on their own behalf, regardless of any other factor like age or whatever else it might be.
I think that's a really interesting proposal, and yeah, like you say, kind of works for people other than children as well. Right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Do you think you mentioned earlier about this kind of adult privilege that seems to be the kind of cornerstone of why people are allowed to vote. Do you think this proposal might just kind of extend this adult privilege to children instead of centering children?
Well, I mean, the idea is to not do that. The idea is to change the voting mechanism so that it's actually centering all people as people, inclusive of children. And so it's attempting to deconstruct this binary opposition that exists in our minds, not in reality, I don't think, between the competent adult voter and the incompetent child voter. And so, yeah, this is my problem with votes at 16, is that it still uses an adultistic logic to determine who should have the right to vote, as people who are either adults or adult-like enough, you know? And I want to overturn that in a more radical way to say that that's not a legitimate way of understanding democracy. So I do think children would be centered. I also think that the way democracy really works is not necessarily through the people themselves in influencing policy directly. It's through representatives being impacted, being responsive to the people. So the idea really in creating a child-centric as well as adult-centric democracy is to force representatives to structurally have to respond to people regardless of age instead of having the mixed up incentives they have at the moment.
Great, thanks. You mentioned a binary there between adults and children, and that maybe it's a little bit more, it should be more murky than that. So do you think there's an interdependency going on there, and is that important for our democracies?
Yeah, I actually think the Enlightenment idea that humans are independent beings was just wrong. Humans are actually interdependent beings. Humanity actually is sort of one of the most interdependent beings. It's our ability for social connection and relationship and organization that is one of our most amazing capacities as humans. Not that other animals and trees and things aren't that way as well, but so the real human condition is that we deeply rely on each other, and it would be democracies would function better if they were based on that reality instead of this fictional idea that individuals somehow live very independently from each other and make their own personal decisions about everything. And you can see this interdependence in many different ways. We have social organization as humans that's complex and far-reaching through cultures and different kind of institutions we belong to and families and things like that. Even language is a highly interdependent phenomenon. Nobody invents their own language. We inherit it from histories and traditions, and then we use it to create moral, legal, and cultural structures in which we live with each other, not just force ourselves on each other. And of course, the environment, we're not independent from the environment as an object to be manipulated. We're interdependently related to the natural and physical environment, which again is something that got lost in the Enlightenment. Well, to oversimplify, but technology, civilization, science, culture, all of these things are deeply interdependent endeavors and recognized as such. A scientist will not say, I alone created, this idea. And so why aren't democracies like that? Why can't we have democracies that are deeply interdependent as well and drawing upon the wealth of ideas and experiences that a population has?
I think that's a lovely note for us to end our long questions on, at least. So we do like to do some quick fire questions to finish. So the first one I have for you is, what is the most common misconception that people have about giving children the right to vote?
I would say that there's such a thing as adult voting competence.
That was lovely and short and sweet. In one sentence, why does childism matter?
Well, because children are systematically being disempowered in current societies, and this is robbing both children and societies and adults of vitally important ideas and perspectives and experiences, and it's undermining all of us.
Thanks. And who or what has influenced your thinking the most?
Well, I learned about children running parliaments in India when I began getting into childhood studies, and I was very inspired by what they were doing in their local communities. And it was of course, after that, there were children like Greta Thunberg and others who are having a powerful influence, child labor union activists, gun rights protesters. And so, I mean, when you look at what young people are actually doing, that's had a huge influence on my thinking. And I mean, I'm also influenced by other liberatory thinkers who cared about underprivileged groups' rights, including their voting rights, but not limited to those, like Gandhi and King and Mandela, and people who sort of recognized that there were deep assumptions at play in their political life that needed to be undermined.
Great, thanks. And what one question do you wish people would ask you, but they never do?
Yeah, I wish that people would ask me about how adultism harms adults, just like sexism harms men and racism harms white people. It's not something we tend to think about very much, but adultism, or patriarchy as it might be called, puts adults in a certain kind of straitjacket where adults like me are supposed to be a certain kind of rational individualists who don't rely on others and don't experience the fully human experience of being a deep part of interdependent communities and such. And I think that's a huge problem for adults.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I should have added that in. And maybe a fun question to end on then. So, if you weren't an academic, what do you think you'd be doing instead?
Well, I probably would be an architect or an artist. That's what I wanted to be in high school. But yeah, I got sidetracked into academics.
Followed the bright lights of philosophy, I see.
Yeah, exactly.
So thanks so much. We always end on the same question. So if you had to pick one thing for democracy to do differently, what would it be and why?
Well, obviously, eliminating age discrimination, because I just think it would make our democracies function much better.
Amazing. Thank you. And thanks so much for sharing your insights with us today.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thanks. And if you enjoyed the podcast, please remember to subscribe. And we hope you enjoyed the episode today. I've been your host, Jess. Thanks so much for tuning in.